Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Functional Longevity Podcast, where we give you insight on how to get fit, feel younger, live better. I'm your host, Chris Border, best-selling author and owner of Y.E.S Fitness. Let me first thank you for taking time from your busy day to listen to what I have to say. I don't take that lightly. So I hope today's information you find interesting. And also, before we get started, let me thank our sponsor, Y.E.S Fitness. Most people lose the ability to enjoy life as they age. At Y.E.S Fitness, we help people age 40 plus get fit so they can live longer and enjoy those extra years doing the things they love to do. So real quick housekeeping here. If you want to get a timestamp or a transcript of today's broadcast, head on over to yesfitnessct.com. Right at the top, you see a button for podcasts. Click on that button and you'll have access to now 343 episodes. You can also get this broadcast wherever podcasts can be found. Shocking sugar study reveals a health link, but is it really that simple? So today we're taking a look into a topic that has everyone talking, especially those concerned with childhood nutrition, chronic disease, and yes, sugar. A recent observational study has gained some serious traction, suggesting that sugar restrictions during pregnancy and early childhood may protect against type 2 diabetes and hypertension later in life. Sounds like a big deal, right? Well, it might be. But before we let the headlines scare us into tossing out every sugar treat and making sweeping health decisions, we need to step back and look what this study actually shows, and just as importantly, what it doesn't. Not all studies are created equal, and we talk about studies here all the time on the podcast. We always need to make sure that the study is credible and really what it's telling us. Because you've been listening to this podcast before, you've heard me say it. Correlation does not imply causation. And as much as I probably sound like a broken record with this principle is absolutely crucial to remember when interpreting research, especially observational research like this. Here's the study, a natural experiment born from history. Let's start with the basics of what the study examined. Researchers took advantage of a unique historical circumstance: sugar rationing in Britain during and after World War II. During wartime, sugar was heavily restricted. But when this rationing ended in the early 1950s, consumption nearly doubled from about 41 grams per day to 80 grams per day. This dramatic and abrupt shift gave researchers a natural experiment. It allowed them to compare people who were born and raised during sugar rationing and those who were born and raised during sugar abundance. The researchers used a subset of the UK Biobank, specifically 60,183 individuals, and categorized them based on when they were born in relation to the end of sugar rationing. The findings on the surface are striking. Those exposed to sugar rationing, meaning they had limited sugar intake in utero and during infancy, had a 25% lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes and a 15% lower risk of developing hypertension. And those with even more prolonged exposure to rationing, from gestation through the first 2 years of life, had even greater reductions, a 36% lower risk of type 2 diabetes and a 19% lower risk of hypertension. Even those only exposed during gestation, conceived during rationing, but born after it ended, saw a lower risk of both diseases and obesity. Now, at a glance, these numbers are compelling. It would be easy to draw a straight line and say that sugar exposed early in life causes disease later in life. Here's what we need. This is why we need to take a pause, take a breath, And remember the fundamentals of scientific research. Observational does not equal experimental. This was an observational study, not a randomized controlled trial. That means the researchers were looking at existing data and identifying associations, not establishing causation. We cannot say for certain that sugar was the sole driver of these outcomes. Yes, sugar intake increases after rationing ended, but guess what else increased? Total caloric intake. When sugar became more available, people consumed more calories overall. There wasn't a corresponding decrease in calories from fat, protein, or starch to make room for the extra sugar. Sugar alone accounted for about 77% of the increase in caloric intake, roughly 150 extra calories per person per day. So the real question becomes, were the negative health outcomes due to sugar itself or simply due to consuming more calories overall? This is a critical distinction because if the issue is total caloric load, then singling out sugar as the dietary villain is not only misleading, it's probably harmful. It can distract from more effective interventions like addressing overall diet quality, physical activity, and body composition. There's another problem with the study. It is based on population averages. We don't know how much sugar any individual child consumed or whether the individuals who ate the most sugar were the same ones who developed diabetes or hypertension decades later. We just know that, on average, people born after rationing ate more sugar. On average, they had higher disease risk later. That's a long chain of assumptions. Also misleading from this data, information about physical activity, other dietary patterns, or social and economic factors that could have changed after the war. Were kids born post rationing more sedentary? Did their parents raise them with different habits? Did the access of healthcare, education, or food security shift during that time? We just don't know. And that makes it risky to draw bold conclusions. And what about other foods? Interestingly, the research also looked at butter de-rationing to see if similar effects occurred. They found no meaningful association between butter exposure and long-term health outcomes. But keep in mind, the increase in fat intake after butter rationing ended was much smaller than the sugar increase. So it's not exactly a fair comparison. More importantly, even in animal studies that claim to show sugar is harmful, it's also in the context of high fat, high calorie, obesogenic diets. That means the animals weren't just getting sugar, they were getting a metabolic punch in the face, lots of calories, lots of fat, lots of sugar. Often they were bred to become obese. So again, is it really the sugar or the total diet? A missing link, lifelong sugar intake. One of the big assumptions the researchers made but never proved is that early exposure to sugar leads to higher sugar consumption throughout life. That's a nice theory, but they didn't track these people eating habits across the decades. So we can't say whether kids who had more sugar in infancy continue to eat more sugar into adulthood, or if their disease risks were influenced by total unrelated lifestyle factors. This is critical because a lot can happen in 50 years. Job, stress, activity levels, smoking, alcohol use, sleep, healthcare access, all of it matters. To assume that sugar exposure in one's early life leads to disease in the 60s, that's a stretch. This leads us to what I think is the most dangerous part of the whole situation: the media coverage. Headlines are already flying, saying things like sugar during pregnancy linked to lifelong disease or early sweet tooth may doom your child's health. And that's exactly the problem. We take a study that shows correlation, and not even a strong correlation, and spin it into a definitive dietary direction. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that sugar is harmless. We know that excessive added sugar can contribute to weight gain, metabolic dysfunction, and tooth decay. We know that a diet high in processed sugary foods is generally not a recipe for good health. But that doesn't mean that sugar causes diseases in a vacuum or that early exposure dooms you for life. That's why we need to stay critical, stay curious, and avoid knee-jerk reactions based on headlines alone. So what should we take from all this? So what we can reasonably take from this study is the idea that early life nutrition matter is valid and important. Pregnancy and infancy are key windows for health. A balanced, nutrient-dense diet during these periods can set the stage for strong development. Second, this study is an interesting historical analysis, a peek into how large-scale environmental shifts can affect population health trends. That's valuable. It raises questions. It gives us hypotheses to test in more vigorous ways. However, what it does not do is provide conclusive evidence that sugar restriction in pregnancy prevents chronic disease, nor should it be used to justify blanket fear of sugar during early life. In fact, overcorrecting in that direction, cutting out entire food groups, demonizing ingredients, or making mom feels guilty for having cookies can create new problems like disorders in eating, nutrient deficiencies, or stress. Instead, the focus remains on fundamentals. What we always talk about: encourage whole foods, limit processed foods. Stay physically active, get quality sleep, manage your stress, support metabolic health through total lifestyle, not just one nutrient. And most of all, understanding the science. Look behind the headlines. The headlines just want to get you to read the article or listen to the podcast or listen to whatever's on the news. So we need to look beyond that. That's what the headline is for. Because good research isn't always flashy, and flashy research isn't always good. So if there's one message I hope you take from today, it's this: be skeptical, not cynical, but curious, thoughtful, and willing to look underneath the hood of any study that claims to have found the magic bullet or the dietary devil. The human body is complex. Disease is complex. Nutrition is complex. This means our approach to health has to be, you guessed it, thoughtful. So thank you for listening to today's Functional Longevity Podcast. If this episode made you think, please share it with someone hungry for better health and better understanding of how information is distributed. And until next time, stay strong, stay smart, and keep questioning the science. And I'll see you next week with more information on how to get fit, feel younger, live better. Thanks for watching.